All right, everybody. Hope you guys are doing well. Welcome to Dudes Talking, episode 63, World Order Heresies with Michael Joseph. Here with me is an esteemed researcher, Michael. How you doing this evening, brother?
Very well. Thanks for having me on.
Now, I've been following your work for a very long time. It's been almost, I would say, about three and a half years now. And I first heard you through the Higher Side Chats, the episode you did on esotericism associated with the assassination of JFK. Um, and ever since then, I had been following your work through your YouTube channel, Schism 206. I am a member of your website, Rockstar Esoterica. Anybody who's listening, I would suggest definitely worth joining with all the research that you have put on there. Hours upon hours upon hours of lectures that you've put on there, Michael. And first of all, I want to personally thank you also too as well, because Jesus used you, and both you and Jesse Spots to just slap me, just be like, "What are you doing?" When I used to be a Christian Gnostic. Because, when you're researching a lot of the world order, where you're researching a lot of conspiracies, when you've been told that you've been lied about a whole bunch of different things, you start wondering, well, I guess I've been lied to about the Christian church. And then a lot of people within the alternative media, lack of a better words, many of them are New Age. Many of them push Gnosticism. Because they're like, oh, well, you haven't, you've been lied to about everything else. So of course, you've been lied to about the history of the church and the Cathars and the Gnostic Gospels, and I was still a Christian. I never went against the divinity of Jesus Christ. However, I did, believe in the demiurge, and I thought the God of the Old Testament was different from the God of the New, both the same God. And I was, very much in error. I believe that you could also reach, instead of faith, you could reach heaven through gnosis or through enlightenment. And how much wrong could I have been? And I remember when I was listening to your occult science series and then later your occult Catholic series, and you just talking about how the Rockefeller Foundation and the Rockefellers had been involved in funding Elaine Pagels, and a lot of the modern day Gnosticism and the Nag Hammadi library that we have today. And I went and researched that on my own. And I remember just being like, no, that can't be true. I would have heard. Someone would have told me that, right? Well, it turns out it was 100% true. And I was never a fan of Madame Blavatsky and Theosophy and Albert Pike. I just thought what they believed in was wrong and what I believed in was correct. And I want to personally thank you. And, Jesus did use you to wake me up. And you did. And I repent of my past beliefs, never to go back there. And how much I'd really at the time just hadn't read the Bible, hadn't read the works of the Apostolic Fathers, or really understood the progression of Christianity and the progression of the church. And you helped me realize that.
Well, I'm glad that I was able to be helpful. And like you said, you you hit these brick walls where you're like, wow, I was so wrong on this or that, and I've certainly had plenty of those moments. So, I've my whole channel is kind of a similar thing. It's a progression of going through a certain amount of research, and something's wrong in general. I think at least anybody who's in the alt media at least gets that. They
Yes.
they don't trust the general system that's going on, and that's always a good unifying place. But it's you quickly find out once you stop talking with people about 9/11 deceptions or whatever it is, then where does the common ground can tend to end? Because then you have to ask, well, what do you do about it? And then that's where it gets kind of crazy. And then you start to realize that in the alt media, it's not really that much different than the quote unquote normie world, as you'd call it. It's just you're looking at things in a much deeper layer, and a lot of the same dialectics that are at play, I think, but they're just hidden, and you're going from the temporal political realm and now to kind of spiritual dialectics, and that's something that, like you, for me, I had to learn the hard way as well.
Yeah, I have a good friend of mine, Billy Ray Valentine from the Infinite Fringe. He always uses this analogy, and I think you might like it, where there's two pens of sheep and that are going to a slaughterhouse, okay? And one pen is very close to the slaughterhouse, and the other pen is far away where you can't see it. So we used to be in the first pen with mostly everyone else, right? And then we thought we woke up and thought we realized about the world order and everything, but instead we got moved to that other pen. But both pens still lead to the slaughterhouse, and you have many people who are in that other pen who think they're awake, but they're not. They either follow QAnon or they're New Agers. And you and I are like, hey, we're still going to slaughterhouse. You need to wake up. You need to realize that this is a deception too, and it is very tough. It's very tough to try to wake people up in that regard. We might have our individual disagreements on certain things, but there are key things that people need to realize, that they think that they're quote unquote awake, when in reality they're not. I mean, if you still think that Donald Trump is our guy and you're MAGA and you believe in QAnon, you're just being deceived just like everyone else is, So it's quite tough when you have so much information going, and you realize that you have been deceived. For most people, that awakening point is 9/11, Usually from there, you can go down to a subjective reality type hole where everything is fake and nothing is real. And that can lead a lot of people down a dangerous path. Sadly, not towards God or not towards, Christianity, which you and I both believe is an objective truth. So.
Yeah, and I think that, for me, it ends up being something you can kind of categorize, broadly speaking, into primary issues, secondary issues, and tertiary issues. But the trick is we all kind of have our own subjective determination of which ones are which. And, again, for me, things that prove something to me might not work for somebody else within regards to certain aspects of things. And so, it's like some people get really into theology and they get really in depth with that. And then like that is everything to them and what proves something right or wrong. And for me, with like the in-depth theology outside of like kind of conventional wisdom, my eyes just kind of glaze over and I just don't have any patience for it. So none of that is going to convince me whether the filioque way is whatever, this innovation that's bad or good or whatever. Like there's a lot of things that I think that get politicized, and then oftentimes, it's a priority thing where there's something that's good, but you make an idol out of it in a way that you place it as having too much emphasis, more than it deserves, right? And so this is why, there's things that are true. Like I think that you've done a lot of work on like health and diet,
Yes.
if I'm correct.
Yes.
And that's a thing that a lot of people get into this, but sometimes people stay stuck and they think that all the solutions are, there's like this secret technology that will cure all cancers and things like that. And it becomes a material solution where looking for better health and fitness is a great thing. And that's going to be a great foundation. But ultimately, I think a lot of people in the alternative media still sort of make an idol out of that. And that's kind of like a pagan materialist mindset still, even though there's a lot of spirituality that gets kind of sprinkled on it. So, it's stuff like that. I'm very understanding of it. I was in that place myself. Yes. And so that's one thing you always have to remember too. It's like I was in certain places and certain mindsets where I was totally delusional about certain things. And it's easy once you get out of that to start to get a little big-headed or condescending about it. And that's really the temptation that I think is the biggest struggle, once you know more about things, to really not turn out to be that kind of Pharisaic kind of person, I guess.
Yeah, I definitely could see that. I myself used to believe in orgone therapy many, many, many years ago. Oh, how foolish was I when you actually really sit down. And many people don't. They don't sit down and read Wilhelm Reich in the numerous books that he actually has he has written, which I myself am trying to do so I can get selective quotes. Both, give context too. It's not I'm going to take one, line and you try to give, a little bit beforehand and after to give context. But once you start reading Wilhelm Reich, and you said, in your videos with Reich that he does write. I don't know if well's the correct word, or at least it's interesting. It's a lot of bullcrap.
He writes eloquently.
Yes, that's probably the better way of putting it. But he was a very disturbed individual, though, and that part is hidden from a majority of the people who promote orgone energy or the teachings of Wilhelm Reich, because they try to say that he was persecuted unjustly by the United States government and the Food and Drug Administration, but it was more than that, wasn't it? It was more than it was. He was guilty of numerous things. It wasn't that he was ripping people off with his alternative health methods that the government claimed that he had done, but there was more to Wilhelm Reich than meets the eye, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty disturbing for me because he's somebody that was, floating around the alternative media, and I never really paid much attention, and I never really got too much into like that whole, all the alternative energy, free energy stuff. That was something I just never really went down that rabbit hole. The most I ever got into that was like listening to people like Judy Wood talk about 9/11, and so. That my whole thing was more about social engineering, psychological manipulation. I'm not like some scientist person, so that stuff didn't really interest me. And I also am not one of those people who's that salvation through technology. I just never been that way, and, I think that ultimately that's probably more closer to reality. But nonetheless, with Reich, it was one of those kind of moments for me that my faith in the alternative media was completely shattered because if this guy was able to kind of get past, like, think about the alt media, it's always talking about we're exposing pedophiles and all these sorts of things, and it's like people are promoting Wilhelm. I just like seeing that dichotomy. It just like I was like, man, there's something going on here. This level of manipulation is just there's something very I don't know how to say it, supernatural about it. Like, this is just, I can't explain this with just.
Well, there is a lot of spiritual blindness, you know what I mean, to it as well. I mean, you do see that a lot in people who are pushing Wilhelm Reich and orgone, and instead of actually taking the time and actually learning about his history and reading his writings, most of them don't. They just go with the mythos because they're spiritually blind.
Yeah, and, not everybody has time to read a bunch of books. Luckily, I was in a unique position in my life where I had time to invest in reading some of these things. And, when I started out doing any of the research, I never did it to, like, make videos and try to do anything with it. I was just doing it for myself because I was hearing a lot of claims in the alt media. And as usual, you don't have a lot of people pointing you to sources, or when you get pointed to sources, they're kind of, oh, it's a website somewhere, right? So, and some of them are pretty bold claims. So you want to know exactly what you're being told here. And so, with all the stuff in the alt media about Freemasonry and Theosophy, and, is it knowledge that's good? They're just misusing it. Is it all bad? You have all these different viewpoints. So I was like, okay, well, let me start reading people like Albert Pike and Madame Blavatsky and see what they say about this or that. And so once I started reading a bit more about what these occultists believed, I found that so many people in the alt media who were trying to tell you what it was about were just so far off. And it was actually kind of to their expense. Like, what they were saying was only helping the occultists. It was kind of like what I call satanic panic, on one side of the coin. And then on the other side of the coin, that kind of just helps the people who say, well, that's not what they meant by this, and they were really talking about enlightenment. And that's going to seem a lot more truthful when you have a lot of people saying that, oh, they were in a, satanic ritual in some castle sacrificing babies because, I got some vision from God that's what happened or something, So it's like,
Yeah.
it doesn't help. I'm saying like the occultists were only being helped by that supreme paranoia of like satanic panic. Now, I'm not saying there's not weird, screwed up stuff that goes with all of that, but I'm just saying that on paper in the writings, like, it's just not there. And so I thought maybe people would want to know that, so I started making some videos on it.
Hold on, real quick. One last thing. I will say this: you used to make me knee jerk sometimes when you would say satanic panic. Okay, because I myself have, as far as doing research into the finders and McMartin preschool and everything, and trying to substantiate, like I always say about McMartin, at the bare minimum, if you read the Witch Hunt narrative by Rossi Chet, which is a scholarly book. He's a professor at, I believe, Brown University, Chet is. So there's no conspiracy in it at all. It's just, in these cases, through the court documents, did molestations occur, or were, do the people who they claim did the molestations, was that accurate, or was that just a witch hunt? Okay. And it seems in many cases that the molestations did occur, that people like Debbie Nathan and Scheidecker put in their book Satan's Silence, that it was all just a witch hunt. It was all just a satanic panic. But in reality, at the bare minimum, in majority of those cases where there's the Glendale Monastery School, which I'll hopefully write my second book on. I have all the court documents that James Tower did molest multiple children. It was the same for Raymond Bucky. For the McMartin preschool, and that there were numerous children, based off of court documents, based off of testimony, and based off of information, that were molested by Raymond Bucky allegedly. So I understand when you say that there is a push towards making things so fanciful, with adrenochrome farms underneath the Getty Museum, for example, which I believe does make true research of what people have tried to done to show the underbelly of the world order, to make people who try to say, well, hey, the Epstein nexus, or hey, the Franklin nexus with Lawrence E. King, don't roll your eye. Most people just roll their eyes and they'll just say, oh, that's a satanic panic. You understand what I'm saying? Like, using that terminology does kind of upset me, but I understand what you mean, but a lot of people wouldn't. You understand?
Right. Yeah, I think what I was saying, or my exposure to it, was there was a lot of claims that are being made that I would see in the alternative media from people just, on
Yes.
YouTube
And I
videos
agree
or
with you
whatever,
on that. Substantiated
saying this
claims.
and that. And, when I look into certain things, I'm like, I didn't see it. And I didn't look into, a lot of these, kind of, I guess, classic cases, like, things like you bringing up or whatever. But it's almost like it's assumed that all this stuff is going on to this Hollywood level degree in every single Masonic institution or something like that, and I guess my point is, like, I'm not saying that weird and horrible stuff doesn't happen, but I think that is used as a huge weapon.
I agree.
So looking into these sorts of things, and also saying, like, when you're bringing an accusation against somebody, you better have damn good proof.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Very much
and
so.
I think that was my issue, is like, I'm hearing all these things left and right, and I'm not really seeing the evidence. Or it's like, well, I don't know for sure, so I can't absolutely say this is true or not. I mean, that's how I feel about certain events, like the hoax aspects and stuff like that. Like, I see both sides of it, and I think that sometimes there was like a little bit too much of a penchant to try to make a definitive conclusion and marching to Frankenstein's castle, and so I guess the fundamental point I'm trying to say is that I saw a lot of things that were kind of like, maybe not too far away from what we see with like the crazy SJWs, right? They get an archetype of something, a bad guy, and then
Yes.
if you just prod that archetype a little bit, and people just go after the archetype without sorting through the documents. And then, like you said, the people who are actually doing atrocities get away with it because people cry wolf one too many
Well,
times.
they do that all. I mean, they do that all the time. They make golems, so people will spend all their time and energy fighting them, where in reality, the true perpetrators get away with it. You see that a lot. I mean, it's the same. It's the same with McMartin. Now, I do believe that there were government entities involved with the McMartin preschool case. And I do believe that children were being trafficked. However, there is more evidence at the bare minimum, as I always have said, that the children were molested by Raymond Bucky, and is shown within Ross C. Chet's book, The Witch Hunt Narrative, which, again, like I said, it is not a conspiratorial book in the slightest bit. It is a scholarly book where he, says, certain children, whether it's Judy Johnson's son or Tanya Magali, that there were evidence of STDs and molestation. Where if you take McMartin and you take it at the grand maximum that you see posted on conspiracy YouTube of the stories of being transported or hot air balloons or anything like that, I'm saying I think that part was a golem to go against what was really happening there at the preschool. And at the bare minimum, molestations did occur, allegedly, but at the grand maximum, there was trafficking, possibly even government connections at the highest level there. But those have to be investigated and fleshed out, and in my opinion, I don't think they very strongly were. And again, Gunderson, he was an FBI agent, or counterintel pro. So his involvement in McMartin may have possibly been there to derail any investigation into McMartin. So all I'm saying is I agree with you. When I first heard you mention that about Pizzagate, you made me knee jerk about 2 or 3 years ago. But then I came to realize through doing this my own research, myself, like with the finders, for example, and try to substantiate the claims that were made and actually try to interview people, try to get documents, try to bring forth new information to corroborate the big mythos around the finders case, for example. It comes that when you start doing that work, it's easier said than done. And that's what most people try to do as an investigative journalist, and there are not a lot of investigative journalists out there, Michael, that are in the alternative media sphere.
So. Yeah, and I think with like the Pizzagate stuff, I don't know, it was so long ago since I made those videos, but to me it was like there were certain things I saw that were red flags that I think people should at least consider to make sure that they don't jump too deeply into, I guess being enticed into making certain accusations when either they're not true or they might be, but you just don't have the evidence, and no matter what, you're going to look really bad. And so, I can't remember quite what that was all about, what I was going through, but I think there was just some weird programming that happened before that. Like there were all these like weird Pizza Hut conspiracy commercials. And at this point, I view all that stuff very differently than I did back then. I think it's all like spiritual warfare and manipulation and influence rather than like this collective conspiracy of men inserting a lot of that stuff intentionally on the whole. I'm not saying that can't happen, but generally speaking, I lean a little bit more towards the angelic or fallen angelic nature of things rather than men being more fully conscious of things. But, I'm still, ask me on any different day, I might have a different answer as to the percentage of which that leans.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing with, Pizzagate. Pizzagate in and of itself was a controlled opposition narrative. Now, were there interesting, raise your eyebrow things about the Podesta brothers or about James Alefantis that needed to be investigated? Of course. But your videos back then were accurate, and it was the same thing that Jesse Spots was saying at the time, granted from a Protestant point of view where yours is from a Catholic point of view, but you both had the same conclusion, and you both were right about that. And it took me a while to see that through doing my own investigations on the various different cases of higher levels and stuff like that and everything, it took me to realize that. And you're right, it is a spiritual battle, and many people are spiritually blind to it and only go on feeling alone and leave what they can't, what they can or cannot prove, and leave out logic. And it's very sad. It's very sad. You see it a lot in the QAnon community currently now, pushing, like I said, adrenochrome farms with mole kids underneath the Getty Museum. Any stuff that's not completely anything you can substantiate in the slightest bit at all. And it detracts away from true victims of these various nexuses, like Alicia Owen or Paul Benassi or Danny King or Virginia Roberts Gouffre, or any of the various people throughout the the different nexus, Katie Johnson and stuff like that. It takes away from them. I didn't mean to get off a tangent, but I guess it does relate to many people within the alternative media also pushing New Age concepts and pushing Gnosticism and pushing, alternative health based off of, the teachings of Wilhelm Reich.
Yeah, and I think that Reich is a perfect example of, the irony here of people being unaware of what he was part of, and that, again, people in the alternative media trying to say that we're trying to expose, pedophilia and stuff like that, and they're promoting Wilhelm Reich. I mean, that's kind of the irony I was talking about, where it's like, there's one right in front of your face. And, to be understanding, as far as I can tell, it seems like Wilhelm Reich was probably molested by his father. And the strange thing about his situation is that in his writings, he talks about certain sexual deviations as being wrong, but he's also expressing his desires for those things. And he's also saying, I will cure these things, but his cure is the liberation of sexuality for children. So that is just like the most absurd, hypocritical thing. So basically you're saying that the person who should be in a mental hospital, or somebody who should be receiving the psychiatric health, he's not the one who's supposed to be giving it. If you can see what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, yes. Definitely.
And so that's kind of the screwed up nature of it all.
Yeah.
It's that he was a doctor, so-called, and he was basically the one who was trying to tell you what is the human condition, what's the nature of, sexuality, all these sorts of things. But he was deeply disturbed, where he should have been getting help, not telling people how to solve their problems. Because that's the thing, if you're so inherently tied to your subjective trauma, you want to make your desires that aren't good okay somehow, and then so you start incorporating that into what you're promoting as the solution. This is no different than Freud. He talks about, every guy wants to have an incestual relationship with his mother, right? And then so he has sort of like this pseudo incest with his sister-in-law. And, that's kind of the aspects of that occult or Gnostic, or kind of going back to that older pagan philosophy that's probably tied to like the more degenerate Greek culture, where they're just inventing reality, but because they have a position of prominence, right? Oh, I'm a doctor, I'm in the university and I'm a professor or whatever. They coast on that reputation, and then their absurd ideas are just accepted with open arms because of the reputation. And that, to me, is the whole psychological movement, or the modern psychological movement in a nutshell, like I was talking about in those videos with Freud, Jung, and Reich. And Jung seems to be the most, the least damaging of them all, but that's not saying a lot.
No,
and
no.
And unfortunately, in a way, he's actually the most damaging now, because he's the person that most people are promoting in the alternative media. You know what I mean?
Yeah, very much so. And I mean Reich, didn't he catch his mother having an affair?
I can't remember. I know that he supposedly had he might have performed an abortion on like his girlfriend or some person he got pregnant, and he might have botched it and killed her, but he kind of got away with it. So there's a lot of weird stuff going on, but I'm sure he had something screwed up in his parents' life. At least, probably molestation from his father. I don't know much about his mother.
Yeah, he caught his mother having an affair, and then when he was a young teenager too, and he ended up like visiting brothels quite frequently, and he's talking
Mhm.
about how much he hated women, and I think too he actually thought about blackmailing his mother and trying to force her to have sex with him when he was a very young teenager.
Yikes.
I mean, you talked about him working on the farm, the family farm, and becoming aroused over horses. I mean,
Yeah, and he's had some weird stuff he said about what he did to those horses, and
yeah,
I'm hoping that was just him projecting his delusional fantasy, like and trying to invent it into a reality story. Because it seemed like, and this is what I'm actually hoping is the case with a lot of these people, their desires, they're almost like they're writing it into existence, but hopefully it didn't actually happen. I think that this is something that kind of goes with a lot of people who are delusional. At least, like, even in my own life, I know, like, there's some people who are a little pathological and lying, and I'm not in this regard, not in like this horrible way, but I'm just saying, like, in these ways that, like, they tell a situation, I'm like, dude, that did not happen like that at all. You completely invented that. I don't understand how they're taking these things out of their head and they're really believing that they happen, and there's something weird going on with it. So for the horse's sake, I hope that was just an invented story, even if he really believed it. I guess that's my point.
yeah. But the sad thing about Reich is the information about the Ergonomic Infant Research Center, on the other hand, as much as I would like that to not be true.
Yep, for sure.
Is likely very much true, where you see it being repeated later with Alfred Kinsey, of these sociologists, psychologists, whatever you want to call them, practicing research on children, and Reich,
it's very disturbing
sexually
stuff.
Abusing children with the group and everything, and him being run off from town to town once it's realized that he's doing these things in basements. And of course, everybody who tries to defend Reich will say, well, it's just because the FDA was after him. No, it was because he was molesting children in basements. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And regardless, there are certain telltale signs when somebody has those, pedophilic tendencies, or there's something sketchy about them. Like, even if they don't actually go to a terrible degree, like, it could go there. So you don't let your family hang out. It's like if somebody knows that there's a registered sex offender on your street, you don't just say, oh, I'm going to give them a chance, and little Timmy, go ahead and go hang out with them. Like, that's insane. But unfortunately, some people in this day and age actually have that delusion. It's like there's a two bicycling couples that said, oh, everyone in the world is really nice. We're going to go into, like, the most extreme Islamic territory and bike for fun, and they got killed. And I'm not here to, like, promote, like, some absurd anti-Islam propaganda, but there's obviously some parts in there that you probably don't want to be in. And it's that enlightenment, every human's born good, but it's society that corrupts them. That's like the inversion of the doctrines and teachings of original sin. So, and you see how that burns so many people, and then they believe it so wholeheartedly that when it burns them, and usually in a very disgusting or a bad way, it's like the trauma from that is so difficult to deal with. Then they kind of go into a lot of that new age stuff to try to escape that. And I'm sort of a victim of that myself on some level, but more so people I know personally have fallen in, and I've had to kind of try to help pull them out of it. And when people are really damaged from bad, sexual abuse, whether it's consensual, but it's still, like, not a good situation to be in, or if it was actually, like, somebody was sexually abused, like, these things happen. They cause a lot of problems, a lot of trauma, and it's really frustrating because I understand why people get into a lot of those ideologies, because it just sounds very nice, and when you feel like a victim, you it's so easy for your trauma to be ridden in all these terrible directions. So I have a lot of sympathy for people in those situations.
Yeah, but it can end up making people make non-logical um, life choices, and instead appeal strictly to emotion. And a lot of times when that happens, people make mistakes, and sometimes they're very fatal.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess my point is like there's a difference between having sympathy for somebody and
Yeah.
enabling.
Yes, of
Um,
course.
and so, but in order to get through to somebody, if you just throw a bunch of objective stuff and they're so programmed by emotional things, there's oftentimes, I mean, I've had this experience a million times
Mm-hmm.
where it never gets through to them. You actually, the only way to get through to somebody is through an emotional
Appeal.
breakthrough in conjunction with that objective thing, you know. And I think that that's why a lot of people have a problem with Christianity, because there can be a lot of people on whatever denomination who can be very Pharisaic about it, and you need to balance out mercy with severity. Now, some people, they kind of need a kick in the ass and they need it straight, and they might need like the drill sergeant version, but that's not everybody. And I'd say that most people, especially if you grew up in the United States, that's not going to work as well for them, because people have been so programmed with that kind of,
Revolutionary spirit.
or just a feminizing,
Mm-hmm.
where you don't want to be mean to anybody, right? The church of nice, as they call it. And so you have to be able to say true things, but sometimes be able to, I mean, I think the best way to approach that is when you admit your own faults and the things that you've done that are similar of a fundamental nature, you kind of share in that, okay, I've screwed up really bad too,
Yeah.
but you can't go on repeating it. Otherwise, things are never going to get better. And I think that that's a better way of approaching a lot of those things. And, that's another problem, I think, in the alt media, too. There's a lot of virtue signaling that comes from, I think, both sides, whether they're on the occult side or the Christian side.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see that a lot. It happens quite frequently, and I understand that if someone is stuck in an emotional mindset and a subjective mindset, um, it can be very difficult to try to talk with them using logic, reasoning, or objective truth. Sometimes you have to appeal to emotion at the same time and use logic too as well to try to kind of accomplish both. It should be very difficult. As it can be very difficult, and even even when we're talking separate from Christianity, and trying to either use apologetics or trying to evangelize. You even see it with an alternative media when you're trying to convince someone, let's say that they believe in QAnon, for example, which a lot of that is strictly based on emotion. Why they have been deceived, because no one likes to admit that they've been deceived. It's very difficult. As human beings, we try to limit that happening, but we should self-reflect as as both you and I being Christians. We should admit our sins, ask for forgiveness, and then from there try to be more Christ-like, try to be a better person, to try to learn from our error. Which there's some people like Donald Trump, for example, who says that he never asks his God for forgiveness. He just tries to do, to do better, which is very much, he learned from his mentor, the power of positive thinking, third degree Mason, Norman Vincent Peale, type logic. And it can be very troublesome. You see that a lot, too, in the alternative media sphere as well. So.
Yeah, yeah. And, like I said, you think back to, when you were duped by certain things and your mindset. And I guess for me, I always try to have this like little internal exercise where I think back to when I was most delusional about, X, Y, or Z. And I think back, if somebody had told me what I'm, saying to somebody else right now who's in that same situation, what would my response would have been? How would I have responded to it? And I think that that's the best way to gauge a lot of these things. And, that's obviously a major theme of the New Testament, measuring the same judgment unto others, the golden rule kind of thing. And I think that can easily get lost a lot of times. and for me also too, and this was kind of reflected in before the Jesuits were infiltrated, there was a Jesuit education book from a guy in the early 1900s I was reading through, and it was pretty amazing, some of the stuff that he was saying about what education should be and how we're so far from that now. And one of them is that when you're saying the harsher things and the more objective truths, and you're standing up for something, you do that kind of in the public sphere, and when you're talking to a general audience, you want to kind of be strong. But when you deal with people on an individual basis,
Yes.
you have to understand their situation a lot more, and then usually there's a lot more mercy and understanding that goes with that once you know the person. But when you're up there talking about things and there's a wide group of people listening, you can't appeal to everybody's subjective situation. So you try to take, a stronger stance on something, but not be overly draconian about it. And then that is going to affect the most people in a positive sense. And then when you deal with people on an individual basis, you can assess the level of mercy and severity that you need to apply to maybe help or get through, and also learn something yourself. And for me personally, I think one of the biggest things that I've noticed is that whenever I start to call something out, or I'm going to, be a guy who stands up for something or whatever, I noticed that within a few weeks, if I, if sometimes I've written my Catholic priests, if I hadn't heard something super orthodox at a sermon, and I'm saying true things, and I'm doing it for the right reasons, and I'm trying to be very respectful. But I also noticed within the next week, I noticed something that I'm doing that is actually violating Catholic teaching, and it's something that I obviously think is important. Or I learned something new that I wasn't aware of, and I'm like, oh crap, I feel like a huge hypocrite, where I was just, saying something to this priest about something he's doing wrong, and then now I just realized something that I was doing wrong. And I think that that's God trying to show you, don't get overly prideful or think that you can be the one who's going to be out there chastising everybody for, being a heretic or just saying something wrong without being, thinking that your closet's clean, I guess.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with that. And it's quite difficult to be able to ask for repentance, to commune with the Holy Spirit, and to self-reflect. We should, as Christians, we should do that often. And it's I mean, it's the flesh. The flesh does not want to do that. The flesh wants to be right. The flesh wants to be arrogant. And I think, you see that a lot, too, within the alternative media. And I'm not saying that I'm not guilty of this. I am human just like everyone else, but I try to be better. And you see that a lot in alternative media, where people just constantly, they'll never admit that they're wrong, and they always want to be right. And it's a problem, and you see that quite often too in the writings of all three of these people, whether it's Albert Pike, whether it's Madame Blavatsky, or whether it's Wilhelm Reich. There is a lot of arrogance within their writing, and interestingly enough, especially with Wilhelm Reich, who is a psychoanalyst, you would think that he would have self-reflection or whatever. There's very little of it, in my opinion, where he's taken a step back and he's like, well, should I think this or should I say that? It is more like, well, I'm going to. And you see that in a lot of the writing of these three individuals. At least the parts that I have read. I don't know if you'll agree with me or that or not, but it doesn't seem to be. It seems to be, especially with Albert Pike, who he, reformed Scottish Rite Freemasonry as far as the degree into the lore of what's practiced by the Scottish Rite Freemasons today. He didn't invent it; he just reconfigured it. And they have great reverence for Albert Pike because of that, which I find Albert Pike and Scottish Rite Freemasonry, just like all Freemasonry, to be abhorrent. But that being said, though, Pike is very arrogant in his writings. All three of these people are. So.
Yeah, with somebody like Reich, I just think he was more mentally ill.
Yes.
Blavatsky, I sense a lot more arrogance than any of them. Pike, I obviously, I'm not a fan of. But
yes.
The other thing to think about with the Scottish Rite Freemasonry is that the Masonry, at some point, it got, well, the story of Masonry is difficult because there was a more Catholic version that was just tied to building stone structures, and there was an actual practical application.
Yes.
And then it started going into all of this philosophical stuff that got tied to this, Alexandrian Hellenism and stuff like that. And so at some point, this split really happened in England, where the Whig Masonry took over and split from the Ecosse or Scottish Jacobite type lodges. And then Pike was actually, as far as I could tell, reforming the Scottish Masonry, because at one point it was supporting people like the Stuart Kings, like the James II and the so-called Glorious Revolution. And so Pike was vehemently anti-Catholic, and
Yes.
And so, in my opinion, he was reforming it to purge it of any Catholicism that was left in it. Now, I'm not promoting the Jacobite Masonry as being like this, amazing Masonry or something. I think that was like a transitioning point, and at some point it just got completely wiped out. And there was also an interesting infiltration of Jacobite Masonry by it was weird. There was like a Jewish angle where the Jews were kind of playing both sides of things. They were backing Cromwell and Charles II, and banking on who would, be on the throne of England, whether it was a king or a parliament or whatever. They were trying to get, into Britain and into the economy and, into the system, right? And so you have agents getting into there and infiltrating Jacobite lodges in France, and this is where things get really murky during the French Revolution, where there are some lodges that are a bit more Catholic. And then whenever Blavatsky's talking about the Catholic Templar Masonry that's profane to her, she's talking about the ones that are promoting a Stuart restoration, Catholic monarchy, stuff like that. That's the stuff that her and Pike hate. They despise that Masonry. And then the true Masonry to them is that Gnostic, Kabbalistic, Talmudic version. And so I think, in my opinion, Pike was really trying to make that version solidified in the United States, because the United States' Masonry, I think, also was a bit more conflated. And this gets into the idea of the golem or the proxy warrior, right? Basically, if you promote the crazy radical Jacobin or modern day version, the Antifa type of Masonry, that's designed to destroy a society and then build it up. So from what I've been able to understand, a lot of these conservative societies that don't believe in all of that, atheistic, godless Masonry, they still use it and promote it in their enemies' territories. And the French Revolution's a perfect example of that. And
what about the American Revolution too, as well, with many of the founding fathers being Masons and deists, and very few of them actually being true Christians, except for maybe like Patrick Henry, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was basically, a rebellion against the old world, and they were rebelling against the rebellion. Now, ironically, the monarch at the time, King George III, I think was didn't deserve it, and he was actually far more of a Christian monarch than most of the British monarchs since, the Reformation. And he was actually somewhat favorable to Catholicism in the New World, and he, approved the Quebec Act, which is allowing quote-unquote religious tolerance on some level for Catholics in like the Canada area. And this actually really pissed off a lot of those founding fathers, and that was one of the catalysts that led to the rebellion. So this is a typical pattern you'll find when Protestant rulers become sympathetic to Catholicism. They actually get a lot of flack and heat, and the propaganda machine starts working against them. You see this with people like Frederick William IV and the revolutions in 1848. This was a Masonic revolution that magically only happened in Catholic territories, and then the southern territories of Germany, which is the more Catholic parts of Germany. And Britain was magically unscathed. And so Frederick William was caught in the middle of this, and he was praising the Catholics for helping fight the revolutionaries, and the Orthodox from Russia helped suppress him. And so this is the crazy anti-Catholicism in the 19th century that I think is incredibly underreported. And, Pike really represents that, and Blavatsky in a nutshell, really trying to pump the anti-Catholic, anti-Jesuit stuff in the 19th century, and then again, of course, in the 20th century, the Jesuits get completely infiltrated on the whole. That's something that the distinction needs to be made, and when people can't make a distinction between those Jesuits and the ones of 350 years, I think that they're really missing a big piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, I'm doing more research on that, following your research and following down some leads of mine as well. Of course, like, the Habsburgs, later being very much influential in the formation of L'Osterkel, which is the right side world order's Fabian Socialist Bilderberg equivalent. And it's just very interesting to see, because I mean, like, I've talked before. I see the Catholic Church, or Christ's Church per se, being a tree that has had different parts of the tree wither throughout history. And Martin Luther, at least, attempted Reformation. Now, you can argue whether or not that was under, lack of a better words, kind of like go ahead. You might have a better word for me or not.
The defamation? I think the true Reformation was the Jesuits and the Counter-Reformation. And the fruits of that you can see in the 19th century, because the Protestant nations unleashed the New World Order. The Protestant princes in Germany that backed Luther, like the Landgraves of Hesse-Kassel, they loosed the Rothschild into banking. The Rothschilds rose because of those same Protestant princes or their lineage. The Rothschild got into England because of that. And so basically it was the two OG reforming nations, so-called, that loosed the Rothschild and created Freemasonry. And essentially the Freemasons were created out of the dissenters, and all of those groups kept attacking the Catholic regimes that were trying to, do the reform and save the old world order. Now, I know that that's probably really insane for most people to believe, but nonetheless, if you go through things like the Memoirs of Jacobinism by Augustin Barruel, or all of the different propaganda in the 19th century, and with the Habsburg stuff, in my opinion, after looking a bit into all of that, there is an effort made to face the reality of these Masonic revolutions taking over. So things like the Christian Social Party, which were against capitalism, both the Whig version, the Jewish version. They were against Marxism. They were against just general liberalism. A lot of liberalism at that time was tied to capitalism. So they were fighting Protestants, Masons, and Jews, but they had to do it under this democratic system because that was kind of taking over. But they were still supporting the Habsburgs and the papacy and stuff like that. Now, the Habsburgs trying to hold on to some sort of, universal Europe under Catholicism was probably a failed project. And I think that the whole group you're talking about, it just, was like an effort that just did not take, and it got infiltrated and basically became the UN. That's the theosophical version of it. But at that point, things were just waning, and, it's like the Bourbon Restoration. They were completely controlled, and there was nothing happening to make that happen. And so that's my opinion on it. But the 19th century, I think, is really the key to understanding a lot of the things that happened. And I think that the Nazis, one thing that's really lost in a lot of the propaganda is just how anti-Catholic the Nazis were. If you read some of their, documents and orders to police, especially in Bavaria, the Jesuits were actually their number one enemy because they were trying to challenge their racial views of the Jews. Now, the Catholics obviously have a problem with Judaism, but it's all based upon spiritual rejection of Christ and all the things going back to the Pharisees, post-destruction, 70 AD, modern Judaism, the Talmud, stuff like that. But nothing about the Catholic Church has anything to do with Nazi racialism. And in fact, Augustin Barruel, the guy who wrote Memoirs of Jacobinism, he's blamed for things like the Holocaust because of stuff like the Simonini letter, which is basically the only actual documentation proof of any sort of Jewish conspiracy. The Protocols of Zion, I think, is a hoax and propaganda. Even though there's a lot of very eerily true things in
Yes.
it. Nonetheless, Barwell suppressed the letter because he thought it would lead to a Jewish genocide, and ironically, he prevented Jewish genocide. But a lot of Jewish historians, even today, or the modern Whig history, will try to blame him for it. And it's unbelievable when people try to conflate Catholicism with the Nazis. I'm not saying that certain people didn't defect, but as to the actual policies and the general
It was very
whole.
theosophical in that regard.
Yeah, the Nazis to me
Occultish.
were just right-wing Freemasonry and Theosophy. If you read Nicholas Goodrick Clark's book, I forget the title. It's like the Aryan Cult Roots of Nazism, something like that. I mean, you think about every New Ager you hear. Just take everything they say and place it on a Nazism, but just add in the racial anti-Semitism, and it's basically the same thing. And they also LARP on the Cathars, being... Everybody loves to talk about the Cathars being like their secret gnosis that they believe,
No,
but
they're
they all
horrible.
have different versions of it. So it's pretty funny, the dialectics that form around that as well.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. I mean, they try to prop up the Gnostics that you see today, like Miguel Connell, trying to say that that they were unjustly persecuted by the Catholic Church. The Cathars were, and they hadn't done anything wrong, and they had secret Gnostic beliefs and teachings, and that's why they were exterminated, which could be farther from the truth. In that regard, I mean, you've done many episodes talking about the Cathars. You actually did a podcast too, proud to be profane, on the Cathars too. I remember as well.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where I certainly understand why people screw things up, and I don't really quite understand the situation because, one, there's so much propaganda from all these different sides. So, for example, there was some woman who was like a Jewish liberal, Simone Weil, I think her name was. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right, but she was trying to say that the Cathars represented this liberal, progressive tolerance that was their secret gnosis, right? And so the ironic thing is, Jewish liberals promoting pseudo-Marxist French Revolution ideas, that should be the complete opposite of anything the Nazis would be attached to, right? I mean, that's what they were really looking out for. Mm-hmm. And so ironically, you have Nazis LARPing on the Cathars as well, but their version is that they held the secret gnosis of the pure Aryan race. So which one is it? Like, you know what I mean? And that's what I'm saying. There's so many dialectics where people take a certain group and attach their ideology to it and say that, oh, this is what they were really about. But since everyone is doing that in a completely opposite way, what's the unifying factor? Well, it's anti-Catholic Church, and it doesn't understand all of the dynamics going on. And I wouldn't say that the Cathar Crusade was not bloody and brutal. Of course not. But they realized that during that crusade, okay, we need to find a better way. And that's why they invented the Inquisition, so they could target individuals and subverters rather than having a giant crusade that, there's going to be a lot of collateral damage. So there is an evolution of that, as much as people love to bash the Inquisition. And then the other angle of it is that the Jews, ironically, who believe in the God of the Old Testament, they promoted the Cathar heresy, which tells you that the God of the Old Testament is evil. Why would they do that? Well, it's because it was attacking their enemy, the Catholic Church. And that's the golem I'm talking about. There's different regimes that will promote things that they don't believe in and think are absurd, but they do it in their enemies' territories, and that's no different than, the American pragmatist empire funding, Brzezinski funding Mujahideen to fulfill American objectives and saying, God is with you. Yeah, sure, he believes that the Muslim God is with them,
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's just part of that Enlightenment tradition.
There's a thin line between Fabian socialism and fascism, huh? So,
yeah, exactly. And that's another dialectic of Nazism and Zionism. And you start realizing that the Nazis are very much to thank for the Zionist state of Israel, because they were working with the Zionist Jews wanted to co-opt Judaism and say, Zionism is what all Jews must do. And they saw that the Nazis were going to be an agent for doing that. Now, I'm not saying that they worked together and liked each other, but it's interesting that they collaborated a lot more than the Catholic Church worked with the Nazis, yet everyone blames the Catholic Church and the Nazis as being the same, and then that the Jews being persecuted by the Nazis was a result of Catholicism. But in reality, you actually see way more Zionist Jews dealing with policies that are unifying on, exporting Jews to Palestine during that time. And I would say about that time, it's just really a terrible time. Like, it was such a big mess. I have a lot of sympathy for a lot of the Jews during that time, going through that, because there were certain Zionists that were trying to basically hijack everything and get all of their objectives fulfilled. And they basically forced all of the Jews to become Zionists at some point. And it was just a big mess. And I guess my point would be that if the Christian Social Party had won out, I don't think any of that would have even happened. Because the Nazis murdered the leader of the Christian Social Party. People like Karl Lueger, if you look into him, he did a lot of pretty amazing things, but he's called a rabid anti-Semite, which is complete crap. They don't understand the context of it. And, he was promoting Leo the 13th's Catholic social teaching and stuff like that. And so that group, I think it's something a lot of people could probably look to in dealing with our Enlightenment regimes today, where we have to deal with all of the liberal democracy stuff. I think that those ways of dealing with it were pretty innovative, and there's a lot of economics tied to a lot of these Jesuits that were not Marxist, not capitalist, but they were synthesizing the aspects of, personal ambition with the social good in a way that wasn't exploitative on either way. And I think that the Jesuits and the Guarani Indians in South America, before the Freemasons conspired to get them all kicked out, were a great example of that.
So let's go back to the Habsburgs for a moment, okay? They wanted to maintain a united Europe, correct?
Well, I mean, that's their tradition, right? The Holy Roman Empire is Europe united under Christendom, despite any problems. I'm not saying that everything's perfect or anything like that, but and they also embodied the Counter-Reformation as well. And I know, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, because my answer to that would be, is La Cercle, one of its first things, which you think would be against like a conservative movement, right, was the formation and maintenance of the European Union.
Right, but I'm saying that what was their version of it? Have you read the documents of what their vision of that was versus what it became?
Interestingly enough, it was different than what it became, because now they are trying to disband the European Union.
Right, and what I'm saying also is that I haven't looked into that extensively, but from what I have looked at, it could, to me, it seems like similar to the Bourbon Restoration. You're trying to restore something that, for whatever reason, like after World War II especially, I think that, basically the old world was completely obliterated, and it's just been, all of the New World Order factions have dominion now. And that during those two world wars, from what and again, these are very complicated things. I don't know everything about them, but it seems to me that during the 19th century, the coordinated effort to destroy Catholicism by left and right factions in Britain, left and right factions in Germany, Jewish factions, both left and right, be them, rabbinical Jews or liberal Jews that turn to Marxism or Bolshevism or any ones in between, and all of the Masonic groups and still the Protestant groups, the carryover, every single one of them unified on the exact same propaganda against the Habsburgs and the Jesuits and the papacy during the 19th century. I find that to be incredibly coincidental. And, and this is a thing. You have to go through the actual writings. And this is what I do in the series in the member section. I go through all those different groups, and you can see, it's like, when you watch Fox and CNN, they're supposed to be against each other, but when they say the exact same buzz terms and the same narrative, then you have to be more suspicious. Well, that's what I'm saying was happening during the 19th century to that regime. And, once it got taken out, if they tried to, resurrect some version of it under a European Union and it didn't work out or it was like ineffectual, I'm not going to fault them for that.
Well, yeah, but then again, with Otto von Habsburg, you get a lot of what Lars Terkel was up to with, like, Operation Gladio, for example.
Right, but the thing is, there's also Habsburgs like Joseph II, which were horrible Enlightenment principle promoters, and he was just, he's tied to like the Bavarian Illuminati, and I think he was like a huge dupe in the end, and he, it's basically the principles that he was promoting that killed his sister Marie Antoinette, and so just to say there's one Habsburg that might be tied to some New World Order faction after their whole regime was destroyed.
Foundation
I mean, that's
of a New World Order faction, not tied to the financier of Lasserkel.
Right, but what I'm saying is that one person doesn't constitute
I know
the whole.
That.
Before that, the whole 1,000 years before that.
No, I'm just saying the modern fruits of the Habsburg family are not good.
So it's Otto von Habsburg, but my question would be, what specifically was the vision and what did it become? I would have to look into that and understand it because I don't have a problem bashing Otto von Habsburg if he was like succumbing to, I don't know, Freemasonry or something. I don't have a problem with that. I'm just saying that I don't know enough about the situation to make a determination on it, and also that doesn't change the history before Otto von Habsburg because there were many, many Habsburgs before him.
No, I know that. I'm just saying that it's modern day version of the Habsburg family. And if you want to read the book, it's called Rogue Agents by David Teacher. I'm reading it right now. It's 800 pages, Michael.
Mm-hmm.
But Otto von Habsburg was a founding financier of Lasserkel in the early 1950s. That would later, Lasserkel would later go on to work with Operation Gladio and Opus Dei, and a lot of the Knights of Malta network that you see here in the United States, and its workings with the Council for National Policy and the Iran-Contra affair.
Right, but the other thing you have to understand is out of the chaos of World War II and seeing what happened, you're in a pretty traumatized state and you can't see everything clearly. And so with something like the Knights of Malta, throughout history, they were badass. They've probably been infiltrated like many other organizations. But, when you look into what the Ottoman Turks and the North African slave trade and the Greek pederasty that was tied to those places, the Knights of Malta were battling that for hundreds of years. Sure. And so I'm not even like, I don't even promote any modern institutions like that on the whole, because it's just such a shit show, pardon my French. I'm saying that the 19th century is when they destroyed the power that was remaining, that was tied to the old world model that kept the New World Order in chains. And so once it was completely unleashed, especially after World War II, and you have some semblance of sway or pull, it's really difficult to, deal with that system when it has complete control over you. And so, I guess I would relate it to this too. It's like, if you're in a system and you're surrounded by wolves, for example, usury, you're not supposed to engage in usury, right?
Yes.
Well, good luck not having a bank account with interest in this day and age. So should I call you a New World Order evil person for engaging in that? So I'm saying that there's a certain amount of, I think, understanding out of the things that happened out of World War II that I would even not just place upon like Catholic people, but just Protestant people or anybody in general, because that was such a destructive and awful thing that it really changed a lot of people and made a lot of people really kind of crazy and delusional. And it happened in all these different ways. So you see it with the Jesuits when Nagasaki got bombed. There's particular Jesuits that were around when that happened, and then that screwed them up, and then they started going off into their weird liberation theology crap. And so there's a lot of things, a lot of traumatic things that I'm not justifying people reacting in bad ways, but I'm saying, you know, it's think about the state of the world at that time. Man, I wouldn't want to be in their position. Let's put it that way.
and I will say it did get us to where we are today. You know what I mean? I mean, I do agree with you on that aspect. And I'm not talking about the Habsburgs of old. I'm talking about the Habsburgs of modern time. You know, and out of it comes this lost or kill Council for National Policy nexus of Fabian socialism.
Right, but why is that group so important as opposed to like Jewish power?
They're just another part of group of it that's just as important within the world order. It's like the CFR and the Bilderberg group. It's all connected part of a compartmentalized world order pyramid. Some people can akin it to a mafia, but I'm just saying it all has connections. I'm not saying one is greater than the other. You know.
Oh, okay. I thought you were trying to say like that was like the head honcho of it all.
No. I'm just saying it's a part of it.
Oh, okay. All right. That changes the context. I got the vibe that you were saying like they were.
I am no
at the top
Jesuit
of this or
world order. No. I think all of the groups have their equal vested interests in being part of the New World Order.
Well, wouldn't that group be against the Jesuits? Because if it's more right-wing, the Jesuits now are much more leftist.
Yes, that is.
Because, like, would any of those groups be, like, super enamored with Pope Francis? I guess that would be my question. I don't know.
The Jesuit group would be, the Council for National Policy hates Pope Francis. Steve Bannon, for example, hates Pope Francis. But there are, you know, it's part of it's kind of like I look at the world order like a pyramid. I'm not saying one is greater than the other. I'm sorry for you mistaking as such.
Okay.
I'm just saying that this is an important part that many people leave out. That's all.
Oh, okay, I got you. I was misunderstanding what you were saying, because, yeah, I mean, there's certainly that right-wing faction that's tied to like all those things you talked about, Operation Gladio. I actually had Tim Kelly for Our Interesting Times on my podcast recently to talk about a lot of those things, and the CIA infiltration, and it's really bizarre because, again, you have that. It's almost like I think World War II split everything into these dialectics. I think that's my point. And then sometimes when people are in the middle, or the other thing you have to consider is I didn't live in Central or Eastern Europe during the Nazis or when, like, you know, communists were a huge threat then too. And I've talked to some people who, you know, have like heritage from there, and I can totally understand how you could see the Allies as the good guys if you were living in that situation, but the Allies, in my opinion, were wolves in sheep's clothing, and that led to Vatican II manipulations, and then the CIA infiltrations and stuff like that. And I think that
both sides were being puppeted by puppeteers, both the Allies and the Axis powers.
Right. And so my point is that if you're living in Europe and you're not in America, and you're seeing the Nazis on one level, and then you're seeing, the repercussions of, Bolsheviks later on or whatever, like that's what you know. You can see what I'm saying.
Yes.
And so right now in America, America, we haven't known the crazy Bolshevik types in that way once they gain power and get unleashed. It's been boiling the frog. And now we're seeing it all over the country. And so now, for me, I guess my point is that I'm getting a little bit more of an understanding for people who saw that and then maybe made some pseudo unholy alliances as a reaction to it, because, hey, let's face it, seeing the Antifa and BLM, I mean, it's happening in my town. They're having seminars that we can go and we can deal with our white guilt. They want to defund our police. They painted Black Lives Matter on our streets here in the Capitol. I'm seeing all this stuff happening in my own town. And so when I understand that a lot of that was the threat during these dialectics of the Cold War, but I actually see it, I understand why people made a compromise. I'm not saying that it was the right thing to do, but I certainly understand it because, hey, man, this stuff is
But what if
wicked.
I raise to you the fact that both sides are controlled and both sides work together for Satan?
Right,
And,
but is there a lesser of two evils?
very
That
excellent,
if you're
very good
going
question.
to absolutely 100% be under one of those factions, I would certainly not want to be under the crazy leftist faction. That's my point.
Unless the right faction is Fabian socialist, which is the wolf in sheep's clothing. So at least with the left, you see the knife coming. You understand what I'm saying? It's overt. You see it coming at you. But the Fabian socialist knife is covert. You don't see that being driven into your back.
Wasn't Fabian socialism tied to like all the Blavatsky and vegetarian and UN stuff? Because when I looked into
Kind
vegetarianism, there
of.
was Fabian socialism all over it.
Kind of. But interestingly enough, a lot of the right-wing part of the world order, whether it's the Council for National Policy, the John Birch Society, Lost Kell, a lot of them have those roots in that very same Fabian socialism.
Right, but the other thing you'd also have to consider is that people can change, because think about pagan Rome, right? Or are you going to say that the Catholic Church is evil because it came out of pagan Rome?
Well, the Fabian
it had a
socialists
conversion.
haven't changed. I mean, look at Iran-Contra affair. Look at 9/11. I mean, 9/11 wasn't, too long ago, 19 odd years. The election of Donald Trump.
But 9/11 to me was more of a Jewish Zionist thing.
You're leaving out the other factions. You're leaving out the other involvements.
Right, but I think that was the primary one. Why would we? You can only focus on so many things.
Well,
Otherwise,
okay. So look at the Project for a New American Century, PNAC, for example. Half of the people within PNAC were Council on Foreign Relations members or Bilderberg Group members, right? But the other half that you never get talked about or never heard were Council for National Policy, Lost Kell members. Both of them came together for 9/11. Both sides of the world order came together for one primary objective.
right, but who benefited the most? To me, it was Zionist Israel. I'm saying that I'd rather focus on what I think is primary, and you were saying that what you're saying is a part of it, which I'd agree with, but I think that, like, you can only process, like, otherwise you're kind of, I don't know, I think it's just sort of, like, overwhelming to try to attack every single aspect with the same amount of effort, because then you're just going to be you're going to be worn out, man.
Which is why I'm not attacking so much the liberal side of things, because everybody else is doing it. I myself am a Christian conservative, but why would I go after that when everyone else is? Everyone else talks about Council on Foreign Relations. Everyone else talks about the Bilderberg Group. Very few people talk about the CMP or Lost Kell and their involvement of very, very, very horrific things.
Yeah, true. I'm just saying that I'm saying from a practical standpoint, most people aren't going to have the time to look into all these things, and they have what they're seeing. Like, for example, if obeying morality is a universal thing, or sexual morality or whatever, and that's what Christ says, obey my commandments. That's like the number one thing. If you love me, obey my commandments. So my question would be, like, for somebody like Donald Trump, like, yeah, he's connected to all kinds of sordid things, I'm sure, but if he was actively trying to, stop Planned Parenthood, or is actually doing some things that are stopping abortions, while the left is going crazy trying to stop that from happening, like, to me, regardless of what he might,
they're not doing anything. He put Brett Kavanaugh in, and he put Neil Gorsuch in the Supreme Court with, John Roberts in place, who Bush had put in. All CMP-backed Heritage Foundation judges just struck down the abortion ruling down there in Alabama. My thing is they appear, again, Fabian socialists, they appear to be against abortion, but they're not, Michael. That, to me, is a greater crime than those on the left who are at least outward and honest with their intentions.
right. And I think my point is that there's also an aspect of pressure that happens too. And I guess for me, like, I think that your viewpoint is a little, it's kind of funny to say this, but like a little Gnostic, where it's like, well, if you can't trust anything at all, anywhere, then God's like, is God in control of all of this? You know what I mean? Like, that's my question. Because it sounds like, to me, it seems more like we have no control of anything. So what do we do?
I never said that. Did I ever say we had any control? I never said that. Now you're conflating.
Right, but I'm
arguments.
saying that, like, your viewpoint is sort of suggesting that, it would seem.
No, my viewpoint's not suggesting that at all. I'm not saying that we don't protest Planned Parenthood or we don't rile against the evils of abortion. I do. I'm just saying to think that the government in any shape or form, which is, I guess you would, I hope you would agree with me on this at this point, that it does appear that Satan is, at least at this time temporarily, in control of majority of the people within power.
Right, but what I'm saying is that I'm not making a god out of these things. I'm saying that they are things that are a reality that you have to deal with all the time. So the question would be, I guess for me, is that, you know, when you hear something like obey governing authorities, what does that mean to you in the Bible?
You talk about Romans?
Yeah, or Christ saying render unto Caesar or whatever. Like, how do you deal with those things? How do you interpret those things?
Well,
I'm just curious.
Okay, so that's a very excellent question. Now, there are many different ways to interpret it. So let's go with Paul, for example. Paul wrote that in Romans. I believe it to be Romans. Is it Romans 8 or Romans 10? I think it's Romans 8, if I remember correctly. Did Paul go against the Roman government when they asked him to do things? Let's say that they told him to stop preaching the gospel, stop preaching Christianity. Did Paul stop doing that because render unto Caesar's what is Caesar, render to God's what is God's? Or did Paul continue and was later martyred because of that?
Well, yeah, I mean, he was martyred, but what is the context? Like, I get it that there are times where if you're being asked to do something directly, primarily violating commandment, like if I was a doctor at a hospital and they were saying, oh, you have to be able to perform abortions, then obviously I'm not going to obey the state in that instance, right?
Okay.
But if they were trying to, I don't know, like do something that was not primarily violating a commandment. Now, the thing is, here's the issue. You can always trace something to violating something somewhere, right? So where do we draw the line between something is obeying an authority that is basically in line with what that's supposed to mean? Like, how do you determine those things? I'm just curious.
It would be, with what, what the writings of the church fathers, what's in the Bible, a person's own individual morality, because we were created in God's image and likeness, as Thomas Aquinas would have talked about, our own reasoning and ability, and our ability of using logic, and what the Bible says. It'd be a combination of all of those things, and I think you could give it from a body like a church or like an organization, but it could also come from God directly. Would be my my biggest guess in all that. It would be God, objective truth in that regard. Would be that. I mean, it's
right.
Very tough. It's not something to sit here. It's very difficult for you and I to say that we know for sure, right?
Right. And so I guess my point is that if you were, like, for something like voting, right?
Mm-hmm. But continue.
Okay, right. So would it be the difference is if the state is subject to God, and that's as far as I understand, the point of Christ saying render to Caesar what's Caesar's, because Caesar is still under God. And so therefore God is in control, and the people in the government are going to have to answer to God just as much as anybody else, right?
True.
And so
on the day of judgment. Yes.
Right. And so if I have a situation where, I'm in a town and there's elections being held or whatever, and there is, a person that is promoting whatever it might be, pro-life sentiment, like they're trying to get rid of abortion. Now, whether they can do that or not, or they will, I don't know. But do I have a duty to vote for them or not? If basically enough people said, well, screw it, like they're both controlled, and then the other side wins and does more draconian versions of abortion, how do you deal with that situation?
Very interesting question. Would you say that there were time periods within the Old Testament that God appointed kings or people to judge Israel?
The Old Testament, yes, but why are we going to the Old Testament?
You don't think that isn't that wouldn't occur today?
Well,
you don't think there have been rulers who God had appointed, and we don't even rulers are not even appointed; they're not even divinely put in place at this point, which was more of the old world, like the divine right of kings. They're elected now. It is a different system. That argument could be made to as well. But you don't think that there wouldn't be some leaders that God would put into place to judge certain countries who have fallen away from him? If that's what people have put into power, someone who falls against God's objective truth of morality, then why wouldn't there be any sort of judgment?
So you're saying that because we deserve it, we shouldn't vote for the other side? That's lesser of two evils?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just raising another counterpoint of how difficult, this is. You know what I mean? It's a very difficult question, because what if you're voting for? Let's say you vote for Donald Trump. All right, let me ask you the two. This will be a two-part question, I guess. The answer to what you're saying to me is, and question two. If Hillary Clinton would have won, as much as I despise that woman, we wouldn't have the QAnon phenomenon and so many people buying into the Trump administration not being part of the world order and continuing the world order agenda.
I suppose so, but I guess I'm not in the QAnon world and I don't really hear it from people, so I guess I don't really notice it that much.
Or even people that supported Donald Trump. I voted for him in 2016. I fell for it too. I'm not voting for him now. But the thing is if Donald Trump says that he's anti-abortion, and he wasn't for many years, he wasn't until it was politically operative for opportunist for him to be that way. Okay. Has anything been done? It says the conservatives have riled against abortion. And remember, Christianity, at least, and you could get me on this, Protestant Christianity was actually for abortions in the United States at the beginning of the 19th century. And they switched afterwards, which I believe is the right thing. I'm glad. It's something they should have been against the whole time. But I guess what I'm trying to say is it worse for them to say they're against abortion and for them to act like they're against abortion, but in reality never do anything about it?
Well, I mean, I've seen plenty of articles where they're barring organization. Like there's it seems like from what I've read, there's attempts being made. Whether they actually end up going through or not, they get resistance. Like my question is, like, these are unknowns that, and like you said, I guess I'm sort of agreeing with you in a roundabout way. It's a complicated situation, so I wouldn't fault somebody for voting for Donald Trump, but at the same time, you don't make an idol out of the person and understand that, like, he could totally, go the opposite and just start giving the other side everything they want and
Yeah.
making more draconian. Like, I'm just saying, since there's so many variables and unknown to I think it's important to do things like you do. Like the QAnon stuff, I've never like understood it. It always sounded absurd to me. It sounded like sort of like a WASP LARP.
That's pretty much what it is, yes. I mean, it's run by those same people. Council for National Policy, Michael Flynn. You probably heard of Michael Flynn and Stanley Crystal, who is a Democrat, and Jerome Corsi. There have been many people within the CMP who have steered QAnon or are big proponents of it to this day. So.
Right. And so the other thing is, too, it's like, I guess is the way I look at leaders. There's a weird relationship that we have collectively to our leaders. And it's similar to what you said. We get what we deserve on some level. But at the same time, if you think about it, if there's a relationship there, well, we change sometimes, and sometimes people in higher echelons can change too, depending on the situation, because if God is in control, he can do whatever he wants, right? So he can put
correct, yes.
And so I think that there's like sort of based on also the knowledge that you have on a situation, if you are engaging in things to the best of your knowledge that are the best option, and like I said, at this point, there is sort of like a lesser of two evils thing that we are just confronted with. There's nothing we can do about that. You know what I mean?
And I understand with you a lesser of two evils as far as a culture war aspect, because I am a Christian conservative. I understand you on that. But as far as a political aspect, both parties are marching for the world order.
Right. And so if you wanted to have a particular version of that, I certainly don't want the side of the, whatever, the Pelosi, Biden,
the
whatever faction.
World order.
Yeah, and if the other one is going to be bad too, then so be it. What am I supposed to do about it? But I think that I still have to be confronted with these choices about what I see and what I put my energy into. And so I put a minimal amount of energy into anything political, a very minimal amount. But I also think that I feel like I have an obligation to do something at the same time, and also think a bit more about my own community and trying to support or not support things in my own community. Now, can anybody you support completely shift and not do something when they said they would? Yeah, that can happen to anybody, but you also don't know that for sure. That obviously there's track records and things like that, but I guess for me, it's like I'm so detached from the political sphere, generally speaking. I just kind of hear people's buzz peripherally. Mm-hmm. I just know that all these things going on are pretty unprecedented, and I don't know how it's going to shake out. But hey, man, I see the crazies who are infesting my town, and I know that there's proxy warriors that they're, under, or they are the proxy warriors that are under certain factions and certain groups. But at the same time, when I look throughout history and I see these different rulers and their situations and stuff like that, I guess for me, I have a lot more sympathy now than I used to for people who are in power, because I know that I would not want to be there. And when I see the different situations that the different rulers have here and there, and then how in retrospect, it's very easy to criticize. And then I look at my own life and I look at the situations where I was in charge of something or whatever. And, I guess to me, it's a little bit humbling. So I try to be a little bit more reserved about when I cast a black and white judgment with things that I don't completely understand.
Yeah,
you still
I can understand what you're saying, but I mean I would still, I'd have to disagree though. I mean, I used to look at it very, very similar to you years ago, and my grandfather always told me you vote for the lesser of the two evils. However, if you're voting for the lesser of the two evils, you're still voting for evil, and it's I don't know. It's a tough discussion, Michael, and I'm
Right, but
glad.
we're having our conversations on technology that was built by slave labor in Africa. Is that's a lesser of two evil?
No, you're right about that. We are. It's a means to an end, which I'm not a fan of. But both you and I accept some of that, you know. And there is a spiritual aspect to this too as well. So
Right, and I'm saying that uh, every situation there is that. So I don't try to get. I guess for me, I'm not saying that somebody else is doing this or not. I'm just saying that I try not to get overly crusady about things that are beyond my control because of these conundrums we find ourselves in where like the example I just mentioned. I think that the political stuff, if somebody doesn't vote or they do vote, I'm not going to hold it against them either way. I would want to know a bit more about the degree of what they think they're investing in, and how much of that is a primary thing or a secondary or tertiary thing for me, and that kind of determines. And I guess that was my point at the beginning of the show. It's like what's primary to somebody might be tertiary to another person, and vice versa, and that's all subjective on a lot of ways in our lives. But then at the same time, God knows the objective truth about all of those things, and we're just hoping our best to be in line with that.
yeah, I mean it's not easy. I mean, I'm not any of the discussions that most people have, at least when they're trying to be honest with themselves and with others. It's not an easy thing. There's a lot of things that we overlook, and there's a lot of things that we accept. And there's a lot of things that we rationalize away too. And it's not easy. It's not. Is there anything else that you want to add, Michael, or anything else that you can think of before we close this evening? A lot of people were enjoying our discussion, by the way. It was open and it was honest, man. It's rare. You usually don't get a lot of that nowadays. You just get name calling and people yelling at each other. And
Yeah, and I think for me, it's like it's such a screwed up time that when somebody supports something or another that's a bit murky, and then 6 months down the road you find out that it was completely corrupt. Hey man, that's just par for the course. It happens,
yeah, it does.
And so I guess my point is I have a lot of sympathy for people in this current situation we're in. In fact, I have a lot of sympathy for people that I think are completely, brainwashed. Like a lot of people in my parents' generation, they're seeing the icons that they grew up with being ripped down that I don't, I don't, I'm not exactly a hugest fan of American Enlightenment principles on the whole, but I also have to admit there's a lot of benefits that I've had and a lot of things I appreciate from growing up here. So I'm not going to be like one of those people who's going to be overly critical of it. But at the same time, I don't have some grand attachment to the Abraham Lincoln statue in Washington, D.C. But I know that the emotional trauma is very heavy on that generation for seeing these things happen. And, when I experience that with people in my own life, seeing that, I understand that, it's all part of a plan, and, they were probably attached to a false ideology, but I also didn't go through the same propaganda that they did growing up. And so, it's just one of those situations for me. All I can do with everything going on is actually, be in my room and do prayers and go to the Latin Mass service where the priest actually calls all these things out, which I'm very thankful for.
Yeah.
And just try to get my own spiritual life in order. I've cleaned up a lot of things in my own personal life that I was attached to that were, not very good, that I didn't used to think were a problem, and I get more and more humbled by that every day. The more I try to conform to the morality, and you hit these roadblocks in your own personal life where you're in a not ideal situation, and you're violating some rules, but there's only so many things you can focus on at one time to try to get better. And I think that was sort of my point with overwhelming people with information. Sometimes can have a detrimental effect, even if you're telling them true things. And that's something that I've learned a lot more recently. And so that's why
we're both guilty of that, by the way.
Yeah, no, I know. I got like a billion videos, right? And so that's what, like, I guess moving forward, I'm trying to be a little bit more clear and concise about certain things or that. And you're doing your thing, doing that with stuff that, you know, obviously I think that what you're doing with the right-wing factions and the groups that you're talking about that are tied to the La Circle or whatever it's called, you know, those things need to be done. It's just that, you know, sometimes it could be overwhelming for people when they see every single element against them as being inherently bad. And that sometimes, I think, makes you lose sight of God being in control, and also the things that are good in in your life and things that you are protected by. It can lead to sort of like it's going to be an oxymoron here, but a Christian nihilism, right? Where you don't find any enjoyment in anything, and you just are in this big ball of paranoia. And I certainly don't want to promote that from anything that I do.
No, and I'm not that way at all. I actually rile against that. You'll see that a lot with double predestination Calvinism. And I am greatly against that. Me and my good friend Ensemble Vide, we have many discussions on Christian nihilism and why it is a problem within Christianity and the Christian faith. So that's something that I definitely try to rile against, because we should be, even though, you know, we are all eagerly waiting for the return of Jesus Christ, though no one knows the time or the hour. That does not mean that we forsake everything here on earth. We should be working with God and with Jesus to improve our lives, to improve our families, and to improve our communities until that can no longer be the case.
Exactly. And I guess it comes down to, do you think even if the ship's going down, you still have to, do you have a duty to still fight for it? And I think you do.
I think you do too as well.
All right, well, we agree on that fundamental thing, and I think that permeates everything we talked about, so maybe we can leave it at that note.
Yes. Well, I want to thank you very much for joining me, Michael. And everybody, definitely go over to Michael Joseph's website, Rockstar Esoterica, which I am a member of. Thank you for coming on this evening, Michael.
Well, John, thank you for having me on. It was a good time.
Thank you, brother. Take care. Bye. All right, everybody. Hope you guys enjoyed the show. I did. Take care. John and Lee show tomorrow. We're going to interview George Webb's brother, Dave Acton, on the John and Lee channel. So make sure you're subscribed to